of Hosea. We're in a section of the book where God is pointing out the sin of Ephraim, the northern 10 tribes, and where he's going to tell that judgment must come and why judgment must come. In chapter 8, verse 14, "For Israel hath forgotten his Maker." And of course, this is what brings on the trouble. In chapter 10, verse 12, God gives the solution. He says, "Sow to yourselves in righteousness, reap in mercy, break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord." See, Israel has forgotten his Maker, so it's time to seek the Lord. And now, since they've forgotten their Maker and it's time to seek the Lord, what are they going to do about it? Look at the last phrase in chapter 11, verse 5. "Because they refused to return." They forgot their Maker. It's time to seek the Lord, but they have refused to return to him. And so there's nothing left but judgment. And again in chapter 9, verse 3, "They shall not dwell in the Lord's land," that is, because it's time to seek the Lord, and they refuse to return. "Because of that, they shall not dwell in the Lord's land. But Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat unclean things in Assyria." Now, we pointed out that all through this section, it speaks of going back to Egypt and going to Assyria. And we've pointed out that this has a figurative connotation as well as a literal. Now, Israel is not actually going back to Egypt. There are some who feel like this refers to a small number of them who tried to escape the captivities by fleeing to Egypt. Most of those that fled to Judah. But there were some that fled to Egypt. But this is probably talking about the fact that they sought the things that you find in Egypt rather than the things of the Lord. God had brought them out of Egypt. See in chapter 11, verse 1, "When Israel was a child, then I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt," God says. But now they want to go back to Egypt. That is to say, they want the things that Egypt offers. And instead, they're going to eat the unclean things of Assyria, because that's the country that's going to take them captive. And the application, of course, is for us. If we save people, if we go back to Egypt, God has saved us out of Egypt. And if we go back to Egypt, we'll end up eating unclean things in Assyria. Now, to eat unclean things in Assyria means to adore something other than the God that saved us. It's for a saved person to desire something or to worship or to crave something more than he wants God. Whatever it might be, material things or false religion or whatever. That's to eat the unclean things of Assyria. And then in the next few verses, he's going to tell that because of this, their privilege of fellowship will be taken away. Verse 4, "And they shall not offer wine offerings to the Lord." Now, the wine offering was simply a matter of pouring out some of the fruit of the vine unto the Lord to show the wine, or the vine, stands for fellowship. Israel is the vine when they're in fellowship with their God. And it says they won't be able to do that anymore. God had a system for showing forth this fellowship in the libation, or the pouring out of the wine in sacrifice unto the Lord. And they shall not offer wine offerings to the Lord, neither shall they be pleasing unto him. Their sacrifices shall be unto them like the bread of mourners. All that eat of it shall be polluted, for their soul shall not come into the house of the Lord. Now, this is what that is talking about. You remember at the beginning of every harvest, before anybody ate anything or cooked any bread, they took a sheaf of the new harvest and took it in before the Lord, and it was used to make sacrificial bread. And then that was to recognize that it all came from God, and then they could eat for themselves. But what it's saying here is They won't even have the opportunity to do that where they're going. They haven't been doing it. And so God's going to take away the opportunity. You'll cook bread for one thing, and that'll be just to feed your own face. That's what this is saying. And you won't be bothered, since it was such a bother for you to do things God's way, since it was such a bother for you to find out how God wanted to be worshipped, and to worship Him that way, the privilege will be taken away from you. And we have that same thing today. I see people complain about the loss of spirituality in their churches, or the fact that they don't get enough Bible or such as that. Well, it's that they want the things that go along with the show of the church, formalized type of worship that caters to the flesh rather than to the spirit. And so if that's what you want, that's what you're going to get, God says. If you don't want to know, if you don't want to seek my face and know how to worship in spirit and in truth, Jesus said, God is spirit, and they that worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship Him. Most people that come out of a church on Sunday morning, even those who would testify that they're born again, haven't the slightest idea what God even means to say when He says, worship in the Spirit. They don't understand that. They think that spiritual worship has to do with organ music or stained glass windows or what have you. And that has nothing to do with spiritual worship. But God seeketh those who worship in spirit and in truth. And if we don't do it that way, we'll lose the privilege. Verse 5, what will you do in the solemn day and the day of the feast of the Lord? In other words, you go through a formality every so often. Every male Israelite came up to worship 3 times a year. Well, they were still going through the form of that, but they were doing it their way and paying no attention to the procedures that God had set out. And so they're going to go into captivity. And so what it's saying here is that day, that traditional day that you like so well, is going to be taken away from you. So what are you going to do? It would be like telling somebody today that loves Christmas and Easter. They like Christmas because, it's Christmas and all the show and lights and tinsel and so forth, and they like Easter because, you get new clothes and you put all that on and so forth, and maybe even go to church on Christmas and Easter. And so it's something that's pleasing. We like to be involved in that. We look forward to those holidays. Well, what God is saying here is if you don't seek to worship me my way instead of your way, then you won't have those pleasures anymore because you claim to be doing it in honor of me. But really you're not. You're just following a tradition that pleases your own fleshly nature. And that's what he's saying here. Verse 6, for lo, they are gone because of destruction. Egypt shall gather them up. Memphis shall bury them. The pleasant places for their silver. Nettles shall possess them. Thorns shall be their tabernacle. Well, here again, Egypt is a place that will capture you. You remember that when Jacob and his family first went down into Egypt from the Promised Land, they went there for sustenance because it would be easier living there. And it was. But they fell captive. And everybody today that goes to Egypt, so to speak, that looks to the world for his pleasure and enjoyment, ends up being in captivity. Just what it's saying here. Egypt shall gather them up. Memphis is just an area of Egypt. Memphis shall bury them. Memphis was the place where they had the tombs to the pharaohs and such as that, and so that's why you have the picture here. That's where their money will go and so forth. Verse 7. The days of visitation, that is, when judgment is visited upon them, are come. The days of recompense are come. Israel shall know it. The prophet is a fool. The spiritual man is mad for the multitude of thine iniquity and the great hatred. Someone gave me a book just recently, and it's a book full of letters written by a Scotsman named Rutherford. Anybody ever heard of his letters? And he lived in the 1600s. He died 1661. And somebody was looking over my Scottish family tree And they recognized that one of his letters was to one of my ancestors. So, that being, they had the book, so they gave me the book. So I've been reading it. It's very, very interesting. And one of Rutherford's letters was to John Osborne, who was the provost of Ayr, the city of Ayr in Ayrshire. And he was one of my ancestors. So this is what gave it a little extra impetus to me. But it was a very good scriptural letter anyway. Not a very long one. But he, at that time, this preacher, the Covenanter, had been taken captive and banished to another part of the country, and his church had been taken away from him because he didn't preach according to the dictates of the state church. So he says, they said what was wrong with him, that he's mad. Well, they said exactly the same thing here. They were saying that Israel's going to know it's going to get judgment, and Scotland did, those leaders did. But the prophet is a fool, and the spiritual man is mad. The attitude of the people is that he's a madman. Now, we read his letters now, books full of them, and we revere him. See, his church was taken away from him. He couldn't preach, so he wrote letters. Wrote letters to everybody, all over the place. Now they've been preserved all these hundreds of years. And he did his pastoral work. Most of these letters are written clear across the country. His church was in the very, very southwesternmost corner of Scotland, on the Firth of Solway, if you want to look it up. And they banished him to Aberdeen, which is in the northeastern part of the country. He said, you got to live here. And you can't leave this city. He was under what you might call city arrest, I guess. He was forbidden to leave and forbidden to preach. So he wrote. And all kind of did his parishioners' work while he was there. And but that the accusation was that he was a fool and he was mad. But he was a prophet, and he was a spiritual man. And anybody with any spirituality could readily see that. Verse 8, the watchman of Ephraim was with my God, but the prophet is a snare of a fowler in all of his ways, and hatred in the house of his God. Now, this translation is a little obscure, but this is what it means. God chose Ephraim to be a watchman unto the people. But Ephraim's prophet had become a snare rather than a help, and had caused hatred in the house of God. They weren't doing their work, in other words. They weren't doing the work that God had set them out to do in the world. Verse 9, they have deeply corrupted themselves as in the day of Gibeah. Therefore he will remember their iniquity, and he will judge, or he will visit with judgment their sins. Now, if you want to read the most sordid story in all the Bible, read the story of Gibeah. It's in chapters 19 and 20 of the book of Judges. And the people of Gibeah, the Benjamites, the people of God, had turned to homosexuality and sodomy and all types of gross sins. And nearly the whole tribe was wiped out because of that. And so if you want to see when it says they have deeply corrupted, if you want to see what it is to go into deep corruption, then read this story of Gibeah. As I said, that's Judges chapter 19 and chapter 20. And you'll see not only the horribleness of the sin, but also the judgment that it brought. He will remember their iniquity. He will visit judgment upon their sins. God says, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first ripe in the fig tree at her first time. Now, the grapes, here again, the fruit of the vine, stands for God fellowshipping with his people. They were to bring fruit unto God. Now, we're going to have the condemnation in chapter 10, verse 1. Israel is an empty vine. We'll see that when we get to it. But what it means was that God brought them into the wilderness and had fellowship with them. It was in the wilderness that He gave them His laws, and He gave them the system of worship, the tabernacle, and He brought them down there. And for about 1 year, it was His intention that they would trust Him. They didn't have any way to get sustenance for themselves or their animals, but just to trust God. And He sent their food from the heavens. He sent manna every morning, and He sent the quail in for meat, and He got water from the rock, and they were just in a desert where there was no sustenance whatsoever. It was God's purpose for them to stay there for a little over a year. At the end of 13 months, He says, you've been here in the wilderness long enough. At the end of 13 months, they had all of their directives from God, that is the Ten Commandments, plus all of the system of worship, plus all of the ordinances, and so forth, the precepts, the ordinances, and then He gave them the tabernacle and the system of worship. And He says, now you've been here long enough. I want you to go into the land. Well, it took them 11 months just to get to the border because they had all kind of problems. You can read this in the early chapters of Numbers. And then after they got there, they wouldn't go in, and so they spent 38 more years wandering in the desert. But He says, I found like Israelite grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first ripe in the fig tree. Now, the vine stands for Israel figuratively, the fig tree stands for Israel figuratively, and the olive tree stands for Israel figuratively, but all in different aspects. They're the vine when they're in fellowship with God, they're the fig tree when they're having prosperity, and they're the olive tree when God is empowering them, or when He's using them. And we find in Hosea 14, the time's going to come when they'll be His vine and when they'll be His olive tree. See, in chapter 11, verse 7, and my people are bent to backsliding from me. Then in chapter 14, verse 4, I will heal their backsliding. I will love them freely, for mine anger is turned away from him, or that's future. I will be as the dew unto Israel. He shall grow like the lily, cast forth his roots like Lebanon. His branches shall spread, and his beauty shall be like an olive tree. See, that's when God will be doing His work again through Israel. When the 12 disciples, or Peter in particular, asked Jesus Christ, look, when you come into your kingdom, what is going to be our position? He says, this is in Matthew chapter 19, one place. He says, I think it's 19. I better look it up, because I suppose you looked all through chapter 19 just to find that, and you couldn't find it. Yeah, it's in chapter 19, verse 27. Then answered Peter and said unto him, Behold, we have forsaken all and followed thee. What shall we have therefore? And Jesus said unto them, Verily I say unto you, ye who have followed me, in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit on the throne of His glory, ye shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, this word judging doesn't mean passing judgment, it's not the idea of a tribunal. It's the idea of governmental process. And so the time's going to come when God is going to exert His power in this world through the nation of Israel. The olive tree will bear, and Israel will be prosperous. The fig tree will bear, and Israel will be in fellowship with their God. The vine will bear. And those are the figurative meanings of those trees, and it'll always fit wherever you find them used figuratively. So he says, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first ripe in the fig tree. He says, it was my intention that you should be materially prosperous. I had a place to bring you. You were going to be materially prosperous. You were going to have lots of fig trees, in other words. And your fig trees began in the desert. What an odd place. But the first ripe of the fig trees were there. But you got into the land, and you forsook your God. You forsook your Maker. And therefore, the vine is going to wither, and the fig tree is going to shed its leaves and cease to bear fruit. See again, verse 10, chapter 9, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first ripe in the fig tree at her first time, but they went to Baal-Pur and separated themselves unto that shame, and their abominations were according as they loved. Now this, they went to Baal-Pur. You'll find that story in Numbers chapter 25. You'll remember what happened. Just as they were about to enter the promised land, the second generation of Israelites, they bypassed the Moabites, and the king of Moab wanted them cursed, so he hired the evil prophet Balaam to curse them. And Balaam wanted to curse them, and every time he tried to curse them, out of his mouth would come blessings. And Balak got all upset about it, because he wanted Israel cursed, and besides, Israel got blessed. Well, that didn't work, and Balaam wanted all of that loot that Balak was offering him. So you know what he did? He says, God won't let me curse these people, but I'll tell you what you do. God has forbidden any Israelite young man to have an affair or take as his wife any of the heathen girls. So what you do, you find the fairest young ladies of your land, and you send them down there to seduce the young men of Israel, and says that'll do the job. And God will curse them. God will punish them. You won't have to, because then they'll be violating God's law. So that's what he taught them to do. That's the doctrine of Balaam, is to pervert your relationship with God. That's what Balaam taught them to do. And this is what this is talking about. Baal-Pur was the god of the Moabites. And you can read all about that, as I said, in Numbers chapter 25. And of course, Balaam becomes quite interesting because he's mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. Peter mentions him, and Jude mentions him, and John mentions him in the book of Revelation. So 3 of the New Testament writers have something to say about Balaam. One speaks of the way of Balaam, one speaks of the error of Balaam, and one speaks of the doctrine of Balaam. So he had a way, and his way was to proceed for monetary recompense. His way is the way of a false prophet that works for the money, so to speak. He claims to speak to God because it's a good way to make a living. That's the way of Balaam. The error of Balaam is this. He thought that he could beg God and beseech God, and God would finally let him do what he wanted to do. And it turned on himself. That was the error. He didn't understand God. And the doctrine of Balaam is to teach God's people to pervert their ways before their God. And you'll find all those 3 principles in relationship to Balaam in the New Testament. I suppose that I mentioned that. I ought to give you the scriptures. The doctrine of Balaam is in Revelation 2:14. The error of Balaam The error of Balaam is in Jude verse 11. And the way of Balaam is in 2 Peter 2:15. So see, he made himself famous anyway. You don't have your name in the New Testament 3 times. But it was a rather poor way to do it. So the last part of that 10th verse again, but they went to Baal Peor and separated themselves unto that shame, and their abominations were according as they loved. Speaking of the action that brought a plague upon the children of Israel. As for Ephraim, their glory shall fly away like a bird from the birth and from the womb and from the conception. In other words, whatever importance and glory they've got, they're going into captivity. Though they bring up their children, yet will I bereave them. And there shall not be a man left, yea, woe also to them when I depart from them. Ephraim, as I saw Tyre, is planted in a pleasant place, but Ephraim shall bring forth his children to murderer. Tyre was probably the city of more pure luxury than any city that's ever existed. And you can read that in Ezekiel chapter 25 through 27. It was situated on the only harbor protected harbor on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, and it was the place where the caravans had to come. And they exacted their duty from everybody that traded there, because the only place the caravans could meet the ships. And they were lived in luxury for centuries, because they were in a pleasant place. But they're not there now. Verse 14, give them, O Lord, what wilt thou give them? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breast. That's just another way of saying that they shall be decimated. All their wickedness is in Gilgal, for there I hated them. Now, Gilgal is the place where the Israelites first set up camp when they got into the Holy Land, or when they got into the promised land there, the land of milk and honey that God had promised them. And the story of Gilgal is in the early chapters of the book of Joshua. I have listed just all the things that took place in Gilgal. And here they are. You'll find these in Joshua chapters 4 and 5. In Gilgal, they set up camp. In Gilgal, they set up the stones that memorialized the resurrection out of the depths of the water. In Gilgal, they were circumcised or separated themselves unto God. In Gilgal, they held their first Passover. That is, they had communion with God. In Gilgal, they ceased to eat manna and began to eat the old corn of the land. And we won't go into all the significance of that. And in Gilgal, they met the captain of the Lord of hosts. And in Gilgal, they set out to conquer Jericho. 7 things they did from Gilgal. And if you read all through the book of Joshua, and even on in to the ministry of Samuel, in the book of 1 Samuel, you'll see that they always started their campaigns from Gilgal, because that's the place that God brought them back to memorialize how He works with His people. But you see, Ephraim had polluted Gilgal, and they had a school for prophets there. If you want to read what happened to Gilgal, or what it became, read the early chapters of 2 Kings, and read some of the happenings there that Elisha had at Gilgal. They had perverted the place that God had used as a spiritual bulwark. So that's what it means when all their wickedness is in Gilgal. For there I hated them. For the wickedness of their doings I will drive them out of mine house. I will love them no more. All their princes are revolters. When God says I will love them no more, see, if you'll see the imagery here, He was the husband, the provider, and they were the wife. But He says, I'm not going to provide for my wife anymore, because she gives all the credit for the provision to her other lovers, her paramours. She gives her love to the paramours, and she gives them credit for the sustenance that I give her. And this is his way of saying they're worshiping idol gods, and they're worshiping the god of fruitfulness and all of that, saying that their blessings are coming from those places. So when he says, I'll not love her anymore, it means he's not going to carry on the husband-wife relationship, is what he means. You don't think of it in terms, because God loves every sinner. He never ceases to love his creature. But this is speaking of a manifestation of love in a particular way. Verse 16, Ephraim is smitten, their root is dried up, they shall bear no fruit. Yea, though they bring forth, yet will I slay even the beloved fruit of their womb. My God will cast them away, because they did not hearken unto him, and they shall be wanderers among the nations. Now, that prophecy was made way back in Leviticus chapter 26. We reviewed this once before, but we might want to point it out again, because it's certainly happened. In Leviticus chapter 26, verse 3, if you will walk in my statutes, verse 4, then I will. He says he will do certain things. If you will walk in my way, then I will do certain things. In verse 4, I will give you rain. In verse 6, I will give you peace. In verse 9, I will make you fruitful. In verse 11, I will set my tabernacle among you. That means I'll dwell with you. Verse 12, I'll walk among you. Or we could say, the promise is, if they will walk in his statutes, there'll be plenty from God, peace from God, power from God, and the presence of God. Then, look in verse 14. But if you will not hearken, then he tells the things I will do. He will do. He will bring distress, drought, desolation, disease, dearth, and destruction, and dispersion. 7 things. If they will do, he'll do 4 things for them, and if they won't, he'll do 7 things against them. And if they still rebel against them, look at verse 32. We're in Leviticus 26. And I will bring the land into desolation, and your enemies who dwell therein shall be astonished at you, and I will scatter you among the heathen, or the Gentile nations, and will draw out a sword after you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. Now, God prophesied that, and that's what all the prophets down to the time of Hosea prophesied. If you will, I will. If you won't, this is what happens. And so, he's simply reiterating prophecy that's been made all through the Bible in this chapter 9, verse 17. My God will cast them away because they did not hearken unto him. See, it said, if you will not hearken, these things will happen. And they did not hearken. So those things were happening, howbeit many centuries later. And they shall be wanderers among the nations. And that's been going on for some 26 or 700 years. And of course, that's what Hosea, it's not going to go on forever, because we learned back in chapter 6, verse 1, come, let us return to the Lord, for he hath torn, and he will heal us. He hath smitten, and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. In the 3rd day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight. In the eyes of the Lord, 1,000 years is a day, and a day is 1,000 years. And I believe this is saying that in the 3rd year, the 3rd day, the 3rd 1,000 years after the dispersion, they're going to be gathered again. And we're living in that 3rd day. Now, the rest of our time we want to spend in chapter 10, verse 1. Israel is an empty vine. He bringeth forth fruit unto himself, according to the multitude of his fruit. He hath increased the altars according to the goodness of his land. They have made goodly images. Their heart is divided. What God is saying, I planted a vine, that's Israel, to have fellowship with me. And they've ignored me, and they're bringing forth fruit unto themselves, where they're going to reap what they've sown, because they will not be my vine. Now, we want to go back. We pointed this out before too, but so that we're in a good basis for starting chapter 10 next week, let's go look at some of the other scriptures that speak of Israel as the vine. Here it says Israel is an empty vine. Let's look back in Psalm 80, the 80th Psalm. Psalm 80, verse 8. Thou hast brought a vine out of Egypt, and hast cast out the nations and planted it. Thou preparedst room before it, and didst cause it to take deep root, and it filled the land, and the hills were covered with the shadow of it, and the boughs thereof were like the goodly cedars. She sent out her boughs unto the sea, and her branches unto the river. Now the psalmist is saying, now he's looking at this vine after they were taken captive. This is God planted you in a good land. You were his vine, and he planted you in a good land. Now look at you. Verse 12. Why hast thou then broken down her hedges, so that all they who pass by do pluck her? And he's saying, why is it that the vine has been broken down? The boar out of the wood doth waste it, and the wild beast of the field doth devour it. Return, we beseech thee, O God of hosts. Look down from heaven, and behold, and visit this vine, and the vineyard which thy right hand has planted, and the branch that thou madest strong for thyself. It is burned with fire, it is cut down, they perish at the rebuke of thy countenance. See, the psalmist is looking at the vine at a later date than Hosea. Hosea says, you're an empty vine, so destruction's going to come. And then the psalmist is writing about the vine after that destruction came. He's asked the question, why is this? Why is this vine, this goodly vine, this nation that God planted to have fellowship with himself, why is it broken down? Well, the answer is in Isaiah chapter 5. In Isaiah chapter 5. Now will I sing to my well-beloved a song of my well-beloved touching his vineyard. Now the well-beloved here is the Son of God, and the vineyard is the nation of Israel. My well-beloved hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill. Verse 2, and he digged it and gathered out the stones, and he planted it with the choicest vine, and he built a tower in the midst of it, and made a winepress in it, and he looked for it to bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes, just brought forth whatever kind of fruit it wanted to. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, I pray you, between me and my vineyard. What could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done to it? Wherefore, when I looked for it to bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes? He says, what could I have done that would have been more favorable? He says, I've done everything in the world that a husbandman could do to a vineyard. And no matter what I do, it brings forth fruit that is of no value. Now, this is a picture of God's relationship to Israel. They had position, provision, protection, privilege, and prosperity. You like all those P's? See? They had a very favorable position, a very fruitful hill. That's the nation of Israel, the land of Israel. And he digged it and gathered out the stones and planted it with the choicest vine. That's provision. They had position and provision. He gave them preeminent position, and he provided in every way. So they had position and provision. Now, in the next is, and built a tower in the midst of it. Now, that's protection. He promised them position, provision, and protection. And also made a winepress in it, and he looked for it to bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, I pray you, betwixt me and my vineyard. What could have been done more for my vineyard? That is, he guaranteed them prosperity or privilege. Take your choice. Which word do you like best? Privilege? What could have been done more for my vineyard? That's privilege, isn't it? So maybe that's a better word. Anyway, we've got to have all P's. Position, provision, protection, and privilege. He promised all those things. Verse 5, and now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge. That is, I'll take away its protection. That's how Assyria got down there, because God took away the hedge. And it shall be eaten up, and I'll break down its wall, and it shall be tramped down, and I will lay it waste, and it shall not be pruned, nor digged, but there shall come up briars and thorns. He says, I'm going to take away the position, I'm going to take away the provision, I'm going to take away the protection, I'm going to take away the privilege. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. So that doesn't leave us guessing as to what the vineyard is or who the vineyard is, does it? The vineyard of the Lord is the house of Israel. So he says, if you abhor position, provision, protection, and privilege, you'll get punishment. And when Jesus came, he says, I am the true vine. You see, it doesn't mean true as against false. Because Israel was not a false vine, but it still wasn't true. It means, you know, when we say somebody's true blue or somebody's not true blue, it means that they're not faithful in performing. When we say somebody's true blue, we mean they're faithful. You can count on them. Well, it's the opposite of that, which is meant here. And so, and that's why Jesus says, I am the true vine. And then he gives this beautiful picture that we have in John chapter 15. And we're the branches. You see, Israel didn't perform that which God had them perform. God's job for Israel, what God wanted, was to bring them in a special place, give them all of this that we've talked about, this position and protection and what is it? The provision, position, provision, protection, and privilege, and prosperity. He wanted to give them all those things. And their job was to tell the world that he was a gracious God, to learn of their God and speak of him to all the world. They didn't do that. So now God has another vine. He's the vine and we're the branches. And that's what we're to do. We're to bear fruit. We're to be a fruitful vine. We're to bring forth the fruit that he wants on this earth. And that's why the story says in John chapter 15, every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he takes it away. Because why let it cumber the vine? And here he cut down the whole vine. But he's not going to cut down the vine. He's just going to cut off the branches that won't produce. Do you ever notice there that the fruit gets progressive? It speaks of first of no fruit, then it speaks of fruit, and then more fruit, then much fruit, and then fruit that remains. I guess we could look at that. We've got another couple of minutes. John chapter 15. Which category are you as a branch in the vine? See, John chapter 15, it He says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that bears not fruit, that's no fruit. He takes away, and every branch that bears fruit, that's fruit. He purges it that it may bring forth more fruit. So in that verse you got no fruit, fruit, and more fruit. And then in verse 5, I am the vine, ye are the branches, he that abideth in me, and I in him, the same bringeth forth much fruit. So you got no fruit, fruit, more fruit, and much fruit. Then kind of fruit he really wants, you find in verse 16. You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you that you should go forth and bring forth fruit, and that your fruit should remain. So we got no fruit, fruit, more fruit, much fruit, and fruit that remains. So how fruitful a branch are we on the vine? The vine's not going to be cut down. The vine is true, but not all the branches are true. And the vine has to be pruned, the branches that aren't true. If we're attached to that vine and we bring forth a little bit of fruit, well, he'll prune us, so we bring forth more fruit, so that our end result will be bring much fruit and fruit that remains. So Israel, disdaining its privilege, has given us opportunity. And privilege always begets responsibility. So now we're privileged. Let's be responsible. Let's pray. Father, we thank you again for what you have to say for us and to us in your word. We thank you for the lessons here. In Jesus' name, amen.